Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ian Haydn Smith, and I'd like to welcome you to this BAFTA Film Awards session on music. If you took all the work that our guests have composed over the years and put it together, it creates an incredible body of work in many different genres. I'd like to introduce, first of all, Terence Blanchard on my immediate right. He's a 5-time Grammy-winning composer, trumpeter and bandleader. He's worked with the director Spike Lee since his second feature, School Days, in 1988, and has been the composer of the majority of scores and documentaries for Spike Lee since Jungle Fever in 1991. He's also worked on films as diverse as Yves Bayou, Dark Blue, Barbershop, and Red Tails. And his score for BlacKkKlansman is his first BAFTA nomination. Also here with his first BAFTA nomination is Nicholas Britell for his score for If Beale Street Could Talk, directed by Barry Jenkins. It's his second collaboration with Barry after Moonlight in 2016. He's a Steinway artist and founding member of LA Dance Project, and amongst his other scores, there's Battle of the Sexes, and also Adam McKay's satires, The Big Short, and most recently, Vice. And then to my far right, we have Marc Shaiman. Mark's just discovered this is actually his second BAFTA nomination after 1993's Sleepless in Seattle. He began his career working in Saturday Night Live and produced a fruitful collaboration with Bette Midler, working as musical arranger and also as a co-producer. And many films he's worked on include Misery, In and Out, Hairspray, and LBJ, and of course, Mary Poppins Returns, which he's been nominated for a BAFTA for. Terence, I want to start with you, first of all, and the score for BlacKkKlansman. It's interesting to hear an electric guitar leading the way in some of the music, and it's from your band, the E Collective. Could you talk about the early conversations you had with Spike Lee about the music that you were going to produce for the film?
Well, I mean, me and Spike have been working together for a number of years, so the conversations are very minimal. Basically, he told me, he said he wanted to have an R&B band inside of the orchestra. But when I got the first cut of the film and I started to look at it, and I saw John David Washington walk into the scene with that afro and the leather jacket, for some reason my mind went to Jimi Hendrix playing the national anthem at Woodstock. And in the 70s, for the young folks in the room, every version of the national anthem was very pristine back then. So to hear that distorted guitar playing the national anthem was a very kind of revolutionary thing. But also for me, it was a very patriotic thing. And with Spike's movies, he's always trying to deal with humanity and trying to talk about, in an indirect way and sometimes in a direct way, how we're all, Americans, and how we all deserve protections and equal and same rights under the law. So that sound of the electric guitar was more of a liberating thing for me, and I thought it was appropriate for the film because of what the subject matter was.
Just thinking about your other work with Spike, watching BlacKkKlansman again the other day, as well as the band, the score has a scope and a grandeur that took me back to Malcolm X, and also your score for the documentary When the Levees Broke. You mentioned the orchestra, working with the band. Can you talk about working with the orchestra and the larger sound that you create?
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because that's exactly what Spike told me when he called. He said, this is going to be Malcolm X all over again, in terms of the scope of the score. So he already set the table for me in terms of the sonic backdrop for the film. So I knew, right away that we were going to have a large orchestra. One thing we didn't have was a choir. That's what we had on Malcolm X, but we didn't have on this. And with Spike's films, he gives me a lot of room. So, there are moments where it's interesting, because we were having this conversation with Barry, the editor, the other day. They always cut pretty tight. There's not much room. But they over the years, they've been learning to leave a little space for me in some sections, Yeah, just a little thing. So I've gotten to the point now where there are moments, where I'll try to be reserved in how I score things, and wait for those moments where I know Spike wants the orchestra to kind of take over. And like I said, he gives me a lot of room to do that. And it's a lot of fun, man, when you're sitting in your room by yourself and it's just you and the film, because I have to be honest about how I'm feeling about the story and how I relate to what I'm seeing on screen. And the cool thing about working with Spike, we're kind of like in sync as far as how we see things. You know, it took me a minute, honestly, though, because he doesn't like underscoring. His main thing is that he wants to have very melodic stuff happen underneath his scenes, and sometimes it could be problematic because there are some scenes that have a lot of important dialogue that's important to pushing the story forward, right? So I had to learn how to kind of stretch melodies and use certain types of instruments for orchestration to make sure that they don't get in the way of the dialogue. But in doing that, it's created this kind of style that's uniquely Spike's thing. And with that, like I said earlier, with the moments in time where I get a chance to kind of let the orchestra breathe, I always have to be careful actually with that because Spike loves music so much. We're always telling him, I know this is going to sound weird for a composer, but we always tell him to turn the music down. You know what I mean? Because he loves it so much, he's always mixing it real hot. But it was a great experience, you know. But the main thing about any of these movies is the story itself. You know, the story itself was so powerful, it really told me what it needed for the film. And that's been my journey in this business, not trying to impose my will on a film, but to try to sit back and let the film tell me what it needs.
Let's stay with story, Nicholas. Working from a novel by James Baldwin, and if anyone's seen the film, you have some text by James Baldwin at the beginning. And one of the things he says is Beale Street is a loud street. It's left to the reader to discern the meaning of the beating of the drums. Just thinking about rhythm in the film, and you have Tish's voiceover, which much of which is Baldwin's own words. Baldwin has that very specific musicality to his writing. Just wondering from your perspective as the composer on the film about the dialogue between the voiceover and your music and the discussions that you had with Barry about that.
That's a good question. Haven't had that question before. I think that there's definitely this question of, you know, when you're adapting something from a book, how much do you take from the book? What is the influence of the book? What's the influence, you know, on the film? How does that translate? One of the things with working with Barry, though, is that he is so much my guide in this. So I read the book and I read the script, and you know, early on, Barry and I would have these conversations before he'd shot the film, actually, where he would sort of come to me and say, you know, early instincts of what the movie might sound like. And the first things he said to me were, he said he was imagining the sound of brass and horns. And the quote that you're referring to has that the idea of like drums and percussion. And interestingly, there's actually in the score, there is rhythm and the relationship of where music comes in, absolutely. But there really isn't much in the way of drums. I think there are drums where the scene where Tish and Fonny are first making love, there's a hypnotic kind of a rhythm that we were looking for, and there actually is underneath the music there is a kick drum that I sort of ran through a low pass filter to give it almost like more of a soft kind of attack. There is there's a percussive kind of rhythm in a lot of the low bass pulsing that I put throughout the score, that I would run through actually some guitar filters and give it kind of an angry sort of a feeling. But you know, the question of how things interact with dialogue versus music is just a constant conversation. I would really echo what Terence was saying in the sense that the movie tells you what it needs, and I think that's really the crucial thing. We're there to serve the movie, and Barry and I kind of go on this journey where we actually don't really know what the sound of the movie is going to be until we're done, in a way. You know, the movie is exactly like Terence was saying, it's telling us things, and we're responding to that. So, you know, early on, I start doing these experiments. I'll show them to Barry. We both sit in the room together and, you know, watch the movie together and try things out. And I think it is about that feeling of honesty where you have to be so sort of honest and open with yourself. It's not about writing a piece of music that I love and saying, here's this piece of music, I need this to be here. You know, everything I write or give to Barry, I want to love, but it has to be right for the movie. and it has to be right for Barry. And I think ultimately that's the goal, and there is this sort of mystical alchemy of what works in a particular place. So, whether music goes in a certain scene or not, we have no idea. We'll try things out. There are scenes that have no music, and then we'll say, what if we put score here? Like maybe. And sometimes we're like, absolutely not. Wow, we tried that. That didn't work. But we're sort of finding that rhythm, I think, as we go. And it really changes over the course of the months, what we decide to do.
The idea of the rhythm fascinates me with this film because the anger engendered by the injustice that lies at the heart of the story, notwithstanding, the music adds to this sense almost of a reverie, not quite a dream, but something more ambient than that.
There is definitely a sense, I think, and part of that is, I think, Barry's overall aesthetic with this film in particular is it's a very rich aesthetic. Barry lets every department bring sort of their most to him, and I think everything from the costumes and the colors and the performances, it is this very rich aesthetic feeling. And there is certainly, in the way that I think music interacts, there is this dreamlike kind of nature to how you're supposed to experience it, where you have moments of, really we were going for moments of extreme joy and love. And then there are the moments like where you see Daniel telling Fonny of his unjust imprisonment, and we are going into the dark, the hellish nature of injustice. And the musical texture there is actually completely different. What we did was we had, for many months, we'd explored really just that feeling of love and beauty. And then it was in April, I think, of last year that Barry came to New York and we were working together. And all those moments of injustice had no music initially. So if you think about the dreamlike nature, that was in love. And then in injustice, it was harsh reality. But it wasn't feeling enough for us in some way. It felt... Barry has this feeling that he's looking for, which is we don't want to tell you how to feel. We actually are trying to convey the actual experience of certain feelings. So we had this idea of what if I took some of the stems of the cellos in the scenes where where they were making love for the first time, and I bent them and distorted them. And Barry would say, how do we break this music? How do we harm it in a way so that the music is undergoing its own destruction in the same way that the world is trying to harm their love? And it just worked. It felt like this horrific sound that was almost coming up through the floorboards as Daniel is talking to Fonny. And, that became its own dark kind of a dream space.
Mark, I want to stay with the dichotomy of dream and reality with Mary Poppins Returns. The first time I saw the film, seeing the perfect synthesis of the songs, the music, and performance story, where do you begin with this? So let's start with the songs and the storyline of how they developed in tandem, and then the incidental music around that.
Well, Scott, my co-lyricist, and me, and David McGee, the screenwriter, and Rob Marshall, the director, and his producing and life partner, John DeLuca, we met in a hotel up on the Upper East Side for around 4 months, not like in a Harvey Weinstein kind of way. We gathered there to create the plot. When Scott and I entered the picture, they had already come up with the idea that it was going to take place in the 30s, somewhat 25 years after the first movie. The books were written to take place in the 30s, but Walt Disney felt 1910 was a more colorful, bright, light time to place it. But we loved the darkness of the 30s and the depression, or you called it the slump, and the idea that Michael Banks is now a recent widower. They had that idea. But once we came in, then we really started at the beginning and created an original musical, which means that you'd really have to collaborate this. We're all just thinking, what if this happened? And, and then we would read all the Travers books. There's 8 Mary Poppins books, which I didn't know. And I was a Mary Poppins fanatic. I mean, I was 4 years old when the movie came out. And that movie and that soundtrack record are everything to me. But I didn't know there were all those books. Maybe it's because I'm illiterate. But so we just went through all the adventures that are in the books because they're very episodic. And we had to create a plot that made use of those episodes and what the lesson of the episode was, how that would mirror our plot. And it just was weaving back and forth. And that was one of the most glorious times I've ever had in a collaboration, especially because all we had to do was talk about it. That's easy. Then Scott and I, then it was Christmas, and then we went into our writing studio after the New Year's. And then Scott and I sat and only sang the song that we always start all projects with, which is terrified with fear, paralyzed with fear. Always, in this case, so ever so more, because we knew we were going to be compared to the greatest song score ever written for an original movie. Me also loving Irwin Kostal, who was the original musical supervisor, orchestrator, adapter of the music from the first movie. This man also godly. So we knew we were, oh my God, how do you even begin to write when you know you're going to get punched in the face, no matter, you know what? Then in the middle of writing the songs, they cast Lin-Manuel Miranda. Yeah. So now you know you're writing for the preeminent writer of his generation, who everyone's going to say, well, why isn't he writing it? So by the time I got to the piano, I was right down here. Oh, my God. But then, you know, we just had to start writing. And we realized by writing, we could show our love and write a love letter and a thank you note to the Sherman Brothers and Irwin Kostal and everyone else who made the first movie and say, this is what you taught us. I mean, I literally, that record, that is it for me. That's my schooling. So, you know, we made a movie that, for me, it's like if you have a great teacher that you loved, who really taught you something that really meant something to you and that you really used in your life or your craft, your career. And I got to go back to them and say, here's what you taught me. Do you like it? I mean, and luckily Richard Sherman is still alive and at 90 years old still has darker hair than me. I don't know how he does that. But he was able to see it and just said the most wonderful things to us repeatedly, because I looked him right in the eye when he was saying it. Looking for, like, you know, in a poker game, it's called the tell, or someone does something that, you know, oh, they're bullshitting. But he really seemed to love what we did. He said, you feel like you picked up the baton and you ran the next, you know, timer. So that's everything. The fact that I even got to sit in a room with Richard Sherman, besides the fact that he was saying these wonderful things, and I got to ask him all the questions I ever wanted to ask since I was 4 years old. Has any of this answered the question?
Yeah, no, it kind of leads me into the next thing I was very curious about with the film, and I think is what works so beautiful about the film. I think a less or a more safe option in a way would have been to have more referencing of the original film. And for me, one of the joys of watching it is just the odd little refrain every now and again. Coming to the incidental music, just the way that you wrote around the main songs. Did you create the songs first and then sort of pan down from there?
But I knew that I knew that Rob and Mark Platt, the producer, had hired us knowing I'd be scoring and that they got this kind of package deal. And so I knew these songs could very well become the foundation of the score. But, you know, a score can't just be the melody of a song. But if you listen to my film scores over the years, you'll see that they sort of are with me, for better or for worse. I mean, I've had a lyric in mind for every theme I've ever written for a movie. In this case, they actually are on screen. And it was when we wrote the song that Mary Poppins sings first in our film called Can You Imagine That?, which was the fourth attempt to write a song for that slot. They kept hearing the songs that we were writing. They go, oh, that's very good. But remember, it's the first time Mary Poppins is singing on screen in 54 years. You think it's good enough? And also, this very idea of a theme, where Rob said, you know, I love this song. There's one song that was really there for months. They even did screen tests on it. And he said, you know, it's funny. Everyone loves a song and can sing it, except for the title. The title was the less catchy part of the song. He said, so go back one more time. And we've been trying to write in the style of the early dance bands of Britain in the early 30s. We thought Mary Poppins knows where she's landed. But this time we just, oh, screw that. Let's just go for the musical theater sound. And we wrote the song, and then after I demoed it, Scott said, now play it like film score. Before you send off the demo, send a demo of you also playing it in a film score fashion. And when I did that and manipulated the chords and the texture and the rhythm, it really did take on this whole other, like a melancholy grandeur that seemed to match where the movie was going. So once we had that moment, we felt like, okay, we know where we're going. And that was months and months before filming, recording. And I feel like I'm talking too much. So
No, not at all. No. Something I'd like to know from all three of you about the idea of universality with the music. Perhaps, Nicholas, we'll start with you. I know people have asked you before about why isn't this a jazz score? Yeah, it's Harlem in that era. It's Baldwin. To me, it's a score that works brilliantly. But one of the reasons I think it works so well is because of the dialogue with the tracks, the songs that are used in the film that locate it within a specific moment in time. But then you move out, and the score could work through time. Could you talk a little bit about that dialogue?
Absolutely. I think there is a connection, and I think there always has to be some sort of a connection, even if it's not obvious at first. Where, for example, in this case, when Barry was talking to me about this sound of what is the sound of brass and horns, and how would I experiment with that? The film's set in the 1970s in Harlem. Barry and I did talk about jazz and the sound of sort of 20th century jazz, and in the film there is incredible examples of 20th century jazz. I mean, you hear Blue and Green on a record player. You hear I Wish I Knew, John Coltrane. So I think my starting point though is always that I don't always want to hear what I'm seeing, and I think in any score, that's kind of what I was, talking a little bit about before with this idea of like, what is the sound of a movie? I mean, there are almost like infinite sounds I think a movie could have, and I think something that I love is sort of trying to find something that feels like it's part of the movie, but maybe you didn't expect it in some way. So, can you hear something slightly different than what you're seeing? Source music can always, is incredible at giving you a sense of time and place. With Beale Street, I actually started with this idea of brass and jazz, kind of like seventh chords. And then I was saying to myself, what if I just use the idea of like extended jazz harmonies as a starting point for writing actually more of like a through composed classical piece of music? So there's a string piece that you see when Tish and Fonny are in a restaurant early in the film. And I actually approached it saying, what if I was writing like early 19th century chamber music, but I was using, and it was all cellos actually, but I was using these sort of jazz harmonies as a starting point. So that sound of like, let's say seventh chords and ninth chords and 11th chords is throughout the film, which to me feels like there's a spiritual connection with 20th century jazz. And yet the overt style I was trying to go for, I think something that was just its own creature. Like I'm not even sure sometimes what the genre is. It sometimes feels classical, sometimes it feels like some other, I don't even know what, I think honestly I often don't even like to think in terms of genres because I think it holds you back. Like music itself is just this continuum of sounds, different styles, different countries, everything. There's almost like algorithms of, maybe they'll flat the six here, or maybe the rhythm is this, but they're just choices, it's all just these notes and, rhythms and chords. And so I think that we kind of, it's like I was saying, we find this sound and it is related to the picture, but a lot of that is almost, I think, subconscious how we get there.
Sorry,
please.
When I watched the movie, the second the music started, I was reminded, and this is a compliment, I'm not saying it's like, of this great records, Ben Webster with strings. Great jazz saxophone player. He made a few records that are so seductive, and the string charts are so fantastic in that 50s New York. Ralph Burns did most of them, and that's what it's. So I thought of jazz immediately, but so beautifully placed in this like semi-classical.
That's exactly.
I mean,
yeah.
Oh, I hated you from the second the movie started. I was like, so good. And so great without the needing to have 3,000 notes and runs, like me. Like, it's so, I mean, the word simplistic seems like a terrible word, but the simplicity, the elegant simplicity in the score, yes, the hatred is it runs
Thank you.
great.
And I will add, I'm in awe to be sitting here with both of you guys, so I'm very honored.
Terence, a moment ago, Nicholas was talking about genre. A very enjoyable element of BlacKkKlansman is the film itself feels at times like a genre mashup. you're never quite sure where you are. So it's great because it unsettles you, which it should. But likewise with the music, I found it very interesting that this dialogue between the songs and your score, you're not just dealing with one type of music.
Right.
You've got the music the clan listens to, and you've got a variety of music. Could you talk about that and how you sort of interacted with that?
Well, he hit on it right. He hit it on the head. You know, being a composer, man. Listen, Stravinsky was one of my favorite guys to steal from. You know, and Stravinsky took Hungarian folklore, but he used that as seasoning, you know, for what he expanded on, right? So with Spike's films, one of the things that Spike and myself always talk about, well, we used to talk about, is that we wanted the score always to have this universal feeling to it. We didn't want the score to be so genre specific because we wanted everybody to feel like they could come to the film. And Spike, you know, like a lot of directors, he'll use source material to give you exactly what the film, where the film is, you know. And with BlacKkKlansman, there wasn't much need for me to go into those realms specifically. We had the R&B band, the electric band inside of the orchestra, just enough to give you a little bit of groove, to give you electric guitar and some electric piano, to say, okay, those are the elements from that period. But we use them just as that, just as colors, you know, not to say that, you know, we're trying to play like Earth, Wind & Fire from the 70s or any of those R&B bands that were very popular at the time, but to have enough of that there to mix with the source material that's there to make sure that everything kind of weaves in and out of themselves in an elegant manner, right? And it's actually pretty cool because like he was talking about the harmony, it's the same thing with BlacKkKlansman. You know, you have these I have this electronic band playing there, but I didn't use jazz harmony. I'm using, you know, the melody itself is using like just fifths moving back, you know, in major thirds, right? And it's more of like a power kind of sound without power elements to them. You know what I mean? Because I was trying to write something strong for Ron, the main character, harmonically and melodically, very simplistic but very strong, without beating you over the head with it. So my thought was, okay, well, now that I have this thing that moves back and forth like this, let me use these other elements just as, you know, just like seasoning and, you know, just like any other thing when you're trying to mix elements together. And I thought it came out very well. It worked well for the film. And it's one of those things, man, where we were talking about it earlier. He was talking about it earlier, where you start off with that idea and you go, well, you know what, man, we can go a little further with this. You know, maybe I can use the guitar actually here. I didn't think about using the guitar here, but let's try it and let's see what happens here. And then all of a sudden, those elements become characters. You know, they become parts of the storyline, you know, and it adds to the uniqueness of the film. Very much like the characters or the actors themselves, you know. There's a talking to Kevin Wilmot, who was the writer. One of the things that I learned from them is that, you know, it's a period piece, but they took a lot of liberties with the dialogue, inserting certain things that kind of brought the story forward. You know what I mean? So they are actually doing the same thing with the script that we were doing with the music. You know, I learned, I didn't know that initially, but I learned later on. And to me, that's the fun of what it is that we do, because I think if we try to go so far back in the past and make things so genre specific, it's only going to reach a certain number of people who actually understand where that comes from. You know what I mean? There's, you know, it's kind of like there are a bunch of kids right now who have no idea about that stuff. You know what I mean? They have no clue. So I'm not trying to exclude them from the experience by saying that, oh, this has to be directly from the 70s. No, we want everybody to experience it. We want people who've never even heard that music, you know, in the far-off lands of some countries that we can't even pronounce, you know, to sit down and watch the movie and go, okay, I can understand what's going on with the story, because the score itself has taken a universal approach to telling the story.
But there is still that wonderful thing with it where, as I said, because of the whole idea of the film itself shifting tone a great deal,
Well, yeah, I mean, well, there's always elements of that stuff we did. Like, with the Klan, man, we used some really, really tight snares. Some of those snares were so tight, I was worried about those guys hitting them too hard because we wanted to really get a really crisp, kind of edgy sound. We did the same thing in Miracle at St. Anna, man. When we saw the U.S. soldiers, we had the big field drums that had a nice round, fat sound, and with the Germans, we used these really tight snares that had like a really crisp kind of sound, and so we went back to that for this film, and it worked rather well, And then there are moments and times there's a subtle shift in the scene where you have the Klan initiation, which cuts between that, and then Harry Belafonte, giving the speech at the college at the student union. So there are minimal things that I tried to do there, because I didn't want it to be on the head like he was telling you earlier. It's not about telling you, oh, you're watching the Klan now. It's not that. It's about feeling, like he was saying, about feeling that you're in a different room, going back and forth, feeling the cold steelness of the Klan, and feeling the despondent heartbreak of being in the room with Harry Belafonte telling the story of the young kid who was lynched. So there's subtle things that I try to do with just the orchestration that you shouldn't notice musically, but you should definitely feel as you're watching the scene.
Mark, again, talking about universality, and you touched on it a moment ago of not necessarily wanting to go back to that particular era, but I'm just curious with the musical, with changing tastes amongst audiences, of how you tap into a classic tradition of the musical and perhaps even the American songbook, but also finding that appeal with modern audiences, or is that a dangerous thing to do and you have to find the voice that the film needs?
Yeah, I was very happy that no one said, can you contemporize this? Especially when Lin-Manuel was cast. I was like, what are they going to, they kept saying, we got to make sure you deliver Lin-Manuel. You got to deliver Lin-Manuel. Scott and I dressed as midwives then for the rest of the writing process. But, Mary Poppins lives in the world of Mary Poppins, and she lives on Cherry Tree Lane in London, and this was London in the 1930s, and she lives in a magical musical world. The world of musicals has its own sound, like even like a classic musical like Gypsy. That doesn't really sound like what the music of the 1910, 1912, 1921. It's just musical theater sound. So luckily no one was like that. And that was liberating, because almost opposite of what these guys are saying about their scores, this was one that there is a genre that we were in, and I was swimming in a glorious sea of the genre. It's a genre I've been wanting to write a whole movie score like this my whole life, and I'm sure there are directors who have walked away from other scoring sessions of mine and thought, why is this schmuck scoring my movie like it's a fucking Mary Poppins sequel? So now I finally had a director saying, schmuck, score my movie like it's a Mary Poppins sequel. I'm sorry I said fuck. So, I mean, and not only me, but the orchestra and the orchestrators, we were all delirious with joy that we were getting to write. And the nicest compliment that Gavin, our conductor, when it was all over, he said, Mark, the harmonies you use, it was just so wonderful to just look at the score and for every little note, to be able to come up with all the harmony you want to do. And we so painstakingly think about it. It was the nicest thing someone could have ever said to me. Once again, I don't remember the question.
No, that's fine. I remember watching an interview years ago with David Lynch, and he talks about something called the duck eye moment, which is something that he feels is the heart of the film, or where he knows he's hit that point, the tipping point, where it's actually working. With these projects that you worked on, did you have a moment where you thought, I've nailed this, I know exactly where I am? Terence? Or is it just the process and it's...
You always feel like you nail it until somebody comes into the room and goes, eh. You know what I mean? So that's always a hard one. In my family, they know it. I'm always, if I finish a scene and I'm feeling a certain way about it, I say, hey, come in here. Listen to this. What do you think? and they'd never want to give me an answer, but that's okay. But you try to just go by your feelings, your honest feelings. I remember the first time I scored Malcolm X, man, that was the second film I ever scored in my life, and I was scared to death. But I had to think about my first reaction to hearing a speech by Malcolm and how terrifying it was for me, and was the thing that brought the opening sequence out of me, right? So when I'm watching these films and I'm going through them, I allow myself to cry. I allow myself to laugh. I allow myself to go through all of those emotions and let those emotions guide me and tell me what to do. You know, with this film, I knew that the montage was coming up with the Heather Heyer thing, and I knew how powerful that was. You know, and for me, I wanted to write a piece of music that was not going to be afraid of screaming to the world about the outrage of what was going on in our country. So I let the music just go, and the interesting thing about it was, being a jazz musician, there are certain moments you feel like you can't write what some people will feel. So that's when you bring in great improvisers, you bring in great musicians who you know can play in the moment and bring something to it that you can't and that you won't see. Because also, I'm always the person that always feels like, you know, if I'm sitting in the room, man, with a film for 8 weeks, sometimes objectivity might go out the window, you know, because I'm sitting there focusing on this one scene over and over and over again. So bringing other musicians in always kind of brings a freshness to it for me. So with Charles Altura, man, he's been in my band. He's a great guitarist, and I know that this guy, you know, has a brilliant mind. I said, I'm going to just cut him loose at a certain point in this one particular piece called Blood and Soil, and let him go. And he knew exactly what the subject matter was about, and he just took it home from there. And it's kind of interesting because he gave me exactly what it was that I was looking for, but in his own style. And there's nothing that I could have written that would have conveyed the same type of immediacy, I guess is the word, or emotion that related to the moment, right? Because at a certain point, it's not score in that particular moment of the film. It's not score. It's just pure emotion. It's because unlike some of these other films, this film is relating the period piece, which is a real story, to what's going on in our country right now. You know, so at a certain point, I stopped scoring the film. I just wanted to write music that conveyed what I knew a lot of people in our country were feeling, and let that play out throughout the end of the film.
Nicholas.
Yeah, that question of like, when do you think you found the sound in a way? I would almost contrast, I think, my experience working with Barry in Moonlight and Beale Street, because in Moonlight, when it was pretty early, actually, it was there was a piece of music that I wrote after reading the Moonlight script, because I felt the Moonlight script was just this beautiful piece of poetry. It was the most beautiful script I'd ever read. And I wrote a piece of music called Piano and Violin Poem. I was really like channeling this idea of poetry. I was like, what would it sound like if I was trying to write a musical poem? And so I wrote it, and I recorded a demo of it, and I sent it to Barry. And this was actually, I sent it to him right when they were starting to cut the movie, but I hadn't seen anything. And that demo is Little's theme, and it's in the movie. You know, he just took the recording and he was like, "This is the sound. This is Little's POV." And in a way, because of the structure of Moonlight, which is 3 chapters, but we are following Little as he grows up through his life, the connectivity of that, I think, once Little's theme was there, which was pretty early on, I think I did feel like I had connected something, because that, you know, the film tells you if you've connected it, and the structure of Moonlight allowed for, you know, you could find something in the beginning, and then you were like, oh, we're going to evolve this, but this is the direction. With Beale Street, I think I didn't have that feeling. I think the idea of brass and horns and this feeling of love, but I think, you know, for both me and for Barry, I definitely did not feel like I had figured it out in any way for a long time. You know, I was talking before about that discovery after quite a few months of The Sound of Injustice. I think there were ways forward. There were ideas of the direction, but Beale Street deals with many different kinds of love. It deals with this idea of almost unconditional, divine love, romantic love, erotic love, the love the parents have for their children. So there's all these different kinds of love, and there's this idea of injustice. And I think that, for me and for Barry, I think we're very focused on the fact that even moments of joy contain moments of sadness, in a way, like every emotion has its own opposite inside of it, and that's what makes it strong. Like joy is joy because in a way it's finite. This idea of like it's so special, you have to cherish it even more because it isn't going to last forever. So I think there was this complexity to what we were going for that definitely took a lot of time and a lot of work to feel like we had hopefully arrived near that.
Mark, I wonder if with your work there are a series of tipping points. There's this composition stage. Then you're going to be working with the cast and depending on who gets the roles, and also the choreography of bringing everything together. And I wonder if it is a series of tipping points or epiphanies that you have.
Yeah, every day there's some version. When you talk about, you have to have such confidence while you're writing, because every choice you make, then you're going to build something on that. So you have to really feel like, all right, I'm sticking with that, because it's a deck of cards that will fall apart. I was reminded, it may not be the answer to your question, which I find I'm being not very good at, but when we were recording the songs, we pre-recorded all the songs before they filmed. We had a 2-month rehearsal period. Then for 2 weeks, we recorded the songs. Even if they might sing live on set, we had everything recorded. And recorded with a full orchestra, which I was shocked that Disney would allow. But Rob was like, I want the full orchestra, 85 pieces. I was like, but what if we change things? Things are going to change. But not only that, he said to me, well, he gave me like 5 scenes he wanted me to score at the pre-record sessions before he had filmed the movie. So this wasn't just about writing a piece of, and when I don't mean just, but this wasn't a moment of writing something that has a mood or a feeling. This was scoring a scene. Specifically, there's this scene where the kite, Michael puts it in the trash, and then it starts to fly on its own, and it goes down the street, and it goes through the park, and the kids run after it, and Jack, Lin-Manuel's character, tries to help them, and then it gets very dangerous, and suddenly out of the dark clouds comes Mary Poppins. This is like a 2.5-minute, maybe, piece of score. I was like, Rob, I can't. I need a movie to score. He's like, oh, you can do it. Yeah, and you're going to do it. I really want that. So I went home once again on the Christmas vacation. This was a year later. And I sat there thinking, he is insane. And I can't believe, after a lifetime of being told, hurry up, less musicians, that I'm going to record music that will never be used. Because how could it possibly fit what's going to get filmed? So I still wrote, and made use of kind of themes, like even when the kite's going, it's actually making use of the theme that starts the movie, the Lin-Manuel sings, and then it goes into other things. And I just wrote, I spoke into my computer the dialogue and read the stage directions with as much emotion and passion as I could, and tried to leave space in between or moved it around once I started writing. Well, I'll move that a little. But I still thought, this is insane. Got to the sessions, and Rob even said, that's wonderful. I don't think we need those 4 bars there. I was like, well, how do you know? I mean, just record it anyway. This is all insane anyway. He said, no, I don't think we need it. So we recorded it all, and to make a long story short, sorry it wasn't, everything we recorded that day is in the movie. Rob is such a brilliant, emotional technician that he knows what he wants, and I just can't believe that there's so many kind of iconic moments of the score were recorded before a single shot.
Did you keep those 4 bars, or are they not in there?
No, they're not in there.
Okay.
Nope.
You've been spoiled now. You're going to be turning up at future projects. I said, no, Rob Marshall let me do this. This is
No, I
my
never,
MO
no,
from now
it
on.
was still so scary. I wouldn't want it to happen again. It was a very specific, unique.
But did you mark in the music where things were happening?
Very much so. I mean, Rob, we were like, oh, this is when that will happen. I mean, you could hear it in the music, and I was just happy he liked what I had brought in. I mean, first of all, there's just that. Is he going to like this? But then, is he going to use it? I remember Nora Ephron on Sleepless in Seattle once. Our relationship had kind of gotten odd, and at the scoring session, after finishing a cue, she went, "That's very nice, Mark. I just wish there was somewhere in the movie I could use it." God rest her soul.
On that note, we are actually out of time.
Oh, I'm sorry, no. We actually ended up having a wonderful friendship. We did. We really did.
I actually thought we
and
were
I
going to have
found out
to...
today that I was nominated for a BAFTA award for Sleepless in Seattle, and it's been such a long life, full of so many things that I had forgotten. Can you imagine? I forgot that I was nominated for a BAFTA awards. That is the essence of blaseness. I am so sorry.
Thank you very much to BAFTA for organising this event, but most of all, can you please join me in thanking Marc Shaiman, Nicholas Britell, and Terence Blanchard.